Good morning. I'm David Autor. I'm professor of economics at MIT. I am one of the co-chairs of the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future, along with co-chair David Bindell and executive director Liz Reynolds, who you just heard from. And our first panel today is on labor market dynamics and our concerns about technological change, globalization, and the plight of average workers. I am thrilled to have with me Susan Houseman, who is the Vice President and Executive Director of the W.E. Upjohn Institute, James Manyika, who is Senior Partner and Chairman of McKinsey and McKinsey Global Institute, and also the Co-Chairman of the State of California's Future of Work Commission, and Fareed Zakaria, who is a CNN host, as well as an author and public intellectual. And so we're going to have about 35 minutes total for conversation. I'll start off with questions for the panelists, and then we'll open we'll ask you to type your questions into Slido, and we'll try to respond to some of them. So James, let me start with you. By most measures, less educated US workers without college degrees, have it worse than their counterparts in other industrialized countries in terms of lower pay, less job security, fewer fringe benefits, and a stingier social safety net to fall back on. Could you tell us about the state of middle class and low wage jobs? What are the concerns and what are the causes, and perhaps even what you would like to see us do about it?
Well, thank you, David, and congratulations on your amazingly terrific and compelling report. So thank you for that. I think one of the things we find is that if you look at middle wage workers and low wage workers, first of all, if you look across the entire set of OECD countries, they've actually generally not fared as well. But it is correct to say that the US in particular, the middle wage workers and low wage workers have fared far worse than other advanced economies. And I think there are a couple of different things. For middle age workers, it's a combination of the fact that their wages have stagnated. And in fact, the number of middle wage jobs have actually declined because to the extent that we've seen where jobs have, occupations have been impacted by technology and a few other things, middle-aged workers in number have been squeezed, both in wages and sheer number of them. What's going on the low-wage worker end is a little bit different. I think you find there that there is generally available work, but the wages have fared far, far, far worse. And in fact, one of the things that's also changed for low-wage workers is what I'd call the fragility of work. What I mean by that is not only are the wages low, but certainty about employment, certainty about hours available to work. Work is becoming a lot more fragile. And if you actually look at as much as we've created jobs in this country and others over the last, since the last recession, most of those jobs have actually been of the alternative variety as opposed to full-time jobs. So this has affected both middle-wage workers and low-wage workers. Let me say one more thing about what's happened to middle-wage income earners and low-wage income earners. Other things, if you look at the cost of living and the cost of things that they have to go through, we find that, for example, the purchase of discretionary products like cars, TVs, flat screens, and all that stuff has actually declined quite a lot. And this has been a great boon, actually, to these workers. However, the cost of basics have gone way up. So if you look at the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of education, they've gone up dramatically to the point where for the median American income earner, the cost of those things consume at least as much as half their income. And if you go down the lower deciles, even more than that. So these have been some of the challenges. Now you ask, why has this happened? Well, a few different reasons. One is, I think, part of it has been the impact of technology in terms of where we've seen jobs be automated and also where we've seen jobs grow. The other part of that is the structure of our labor markets. We know that most of the job growth and the largest share of workers now work in the service sectors. And the service sectors have, by and large, have tended to be lower wage jobs. These are retail service sectors. These are care sectors. There's a whole range of service. So the shift has been one of the drivers. The other reason has been the disappearance of the lowering of labor market protections, as well as worker voice. we know that there's, the power of work has declined dramatically. One of the things we found in the Future Work Commission that I'm co-chairing in California is also just how much worker power has declined. Let me make one more thing, then I'll stop. I think one of the challenges we haven't talked about so far in the case of the United States is what I'll call the geography of work. We know that if you look across the United States, for example, as much as we've seen jobs grow over since the last recession in 2008, most of that job growth, 2/3 of it has happened in about 25 metropolitan areas and a few high growth hubs outside of those metropolitan areas. And other parts of the country have fared far, far worse. So this question of how do we think about the geography of work for low-wage workers as well as middle-wage workers is actually one of the more profound challenges we should think about.
That's terrific. Thank you. Let me sort of hand that question over to Susan Houseman, and let me sort of tee up a little more. Many would say the U.S. has kind of a no guardrails economy, right? It's as close to laissez-faire as we find among rich industrialized countries. Does the U.S. benefit from this kind of no guardrails country? How do our institutions compare? And let's say you were to compare us to Denmark, for example, a country that is, in many ways, has a free market and lots of hiring and firing, and yet has a very different institutional structure. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, Susan, on how these compare and how it's working for us and others. Susan, unfortunately, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Great.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for this excellent forum. So to first, address your question, does the U.S. broadly benefit from a no guardrails economy? And we don't see evidence of much higher GDP growth rates. Certainly, the United States is a good place for high-wage workers to be, but not for low-wage and those in the middle. We saw that in the data that Elizabeth presented. So in terms of whether we can learn lessons from other countries, in particular Denmark, Denmark is known for its so-called system of flexicurity. As you mentioned, it's flexible in the sense that it's easy to hire and fire workers, but it's secure in the sense that it has a strong safety net of benefits for the unemployed and active labor market programs that help them train and find new jobs. The United States has the flexibility, but we don't have the security component. And clearly, the U.S. should be improving its unemployment insurance system to make it more generous. It's one of the least generous in the advanced world, and it spends relatively little on active labor market programs. Those are likely to be more important in the future with growing adoption of technology, displacement from globalization, and the like. But I want to mention another often neglected feature of the Danish system that's important for its economic success and lower inequality. And that is that the Danish system has a long history of labor management cooperation. About 2/3 of Danish workers are union members. Strikes are uncommon. Compare that to the United States, where unionization rates have dropped to around 10%. Okay, conceptually, I like to think about there being two broad ways to improve economic outcomes for low-wage workers for reducing inequality. One is that the government steps in with regulations that dictate minimum wage, benefits, and working conditions. The second broad way is to set up rights that strengthen worker organizations and promote bargaining between labor and management. In Denmark, as well as in Germany, for example, these rights are well established. The government steps back and labor and management negotiate many of the details of the conditions of work, wages, benefits, and work conditions. They don't have minimum wages. Those are bargained, okay? So in contrast to Denmark and Germany and other countries, we have a long history of labor management confrontation, not cooperation. And in recent decades, unions have been greatly weakened. So what can the United States do? As I mentioned, we certainly should strengthen our unemployment insurance system. and active labor market programs that help people transition back to work. We certainly, as is mentioned in the report, can start by trying to build labor organizations by reversing so-called right-to-work laws that have been passed in many states that make it more difficult for unions to organize, amongst other, other initiatives that we could take. But realistically, given our institutions, the most viable short-term options in many cases will involve some type of government regulation. So we should raise the federal minimum wage. That hasn't been done in over a decade. We should adopt, this is not a new recommendation, but we should certainly adopt universal health insurance. I would take it out of the employment situation. We should increase, as I mentioned, funding for training services, and also to pick up on something that James mentioned, we should be concerned about the growth of non-traditional work arrangements. So James mentioned, for example, the growth in the number of workers who are on unpredictable and inconsistent schedules, which leads to earnings instability. That is one concern. In addition, and the one that I'll focus on a bit in closing, is that many people work as independent contractors or in informal non-employee arrangements. And so these individuals aren't covered. To the extent that we're trying to regulate and improve working conditions, these people fall outside, to a large degree, government regulations or laws. Because they're technically self-employed, they are not covered by minimum wage and hours logs. They can't unionize. They're not eligible for unemployment insurance or workers' compensation, and they can't access employer-provided benefits like health insurance and retirement benefits. Independent contractors or non-employer work is likely understated in our data, as was emphasized in a recent National Academy of Sciences panel that I was on. Of course, one has to acknowledge that many independent contractors are high-paid professionals, but many are also low-paid workers who are misclassified as independent contractors. Why is this the case? Well, likely because labor unions are weak and there's little enforcement of the federal and state laws here. So the General Accountability Office, a number of years ago, recommended much greater enforcement of existing laws. That was undertaken in the Obama administration. It was suspended in the current administration. It should be taken up again. So let me stop there.
Great, that was terrific. I want to just highlight a couple of points that were made, and then I want to move quickly forward. So one, I think something that is in common with what James and Susan both said is, median wage workers have not done great in most places, but they've done much worse in the United States. And the US doesn't seem to be getting a very positive return on its inequality. That is, we have a lot of inequality, but we do not have faster growth. There's no evidence that we face this trade-off between, making workers better off and making the country somehow worse off. The second point I want to emphasize is what James said about the cost of living. The cost of living index is a bundle of everything from, what do clothing and TVs cost to what does healthcare and education cost. And of course, some of those things are not closely substitutable. So if I have a larger TV, it doesn't really substitute for not having a college education. And a college education has become more essential over time for people to enter the middle class. And of course, healthcare has never been really optional. And so those two things are getting much more expensive. And we don't really have a lot of choice about whether we invest in them as individuals and households. So now let me zoom out a little. We've already talked about Canada and Denmark, and I like to emphasize that Denmark may seem very far away institutionally from the United States, but Canada is both physically and institutionally very close to the United States, and yet there are startling differences, as Elizabeth Reynolds pointed out in her introduction. So now let me turn the question over to Fareed. Zooming out further, China's rise has challenged the US on many fronts, and we've talked about this in manufacturing employment, in military strength, in loss of technological leadership. But some would say that our China obsession reflects a broader fear that, quote, globalization has made the US less economically secure. What is the globalization effect in the United States, and how does it connect to the broad structural shift that we are currently facing?
Thanks, David. I mean, it's a very big question, and it's a big question that you have in part and very famously answered. So let me make sure, yeah, everyone can hear me, right? So let me begin by saying that I share, just so we understand, we all have the same facts, unlike what happens in political discourse. I think we all agree that the American median worker has not done very well, that America's per capita growth rate is not that much higher than other places, and that therefore, there doesn't seem to be, as you said, some great particular benefit from it. But then the question becomes, what are the causes and what are the remedies, right? And so one of the big causes that you hear about on the political trail a lot is it's China, it's to a certain extent Mexico, and as you well know, you added a great deal of intellectual heft to that argument with your work on the China effect. And I'm glad that you called it now the globalization effect, because that is really what it is, more than the China effect. China happens to be the one place where you could very easily collect all that globalization effect and show it. But, if you imagine there was no country like China, my guess is most of this stuff would have happened. It would have just, the benefit would have accrued to 25 other countries in smaller aspects, but you would have had the same effect. I would add one more point, which is that clearly it is difficult to disentangle the globalization effect from the technology effect. When you do outsourcing in India, how much of that is the capacity to outsource work that can be moved back and forth on, via emails, accounting, law, even medical, X-rays, and how much of it is purely globalization, how much is purely information revolution. Tough to disentangle, but the real question is, what can one do about this? So in order to understand that, what I've tried to do is to look at other countries where they have faced many of the same issues and how have they responded. So if you look at Germany, right? Germany is a country that people think of as having maintained its manufacturing base to a much larger extent than the US has. And it's true, but it has done it at the cost of substantial dynamism in terms of its ability to kind of really move into the fourth industrial revolution. So what are Germany's greatest industries still? Cars, chemicals, machine tools. These are all industries from the 1880s and 1920s. In the whole area of the information revolution, Germany has one great company, SAP, which is 30 years old and not really at the cutting edge. If you ask yourself, what is it that other countries have been able to do to maintain this core manufacturing base? What you find is the numbers, even for Germany, are not that great. Manufacturing as a percentage of total employment has gone down even in Germany. So what's the answer? Well, if you look at the Nordic model, I want to emphasize for a second the flex part that you talked about. It is important to remember something that Bernie Sanders did not often talk about on the campaign trail, that Denmark scores higher on the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom than the United States. Canada scores higher on the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. Why? Because they are actually both more free market. First of all, they have the lower tariffs. They're much more exposed to international trade, but they also actually have lighter regulatory burdens. So the model there is clearly you use the golden goose of capitalism to generate a lot of income, and then you tax it, and then and then we can talk about what you do with the taxes. By the way, those taxes are pretty regressive, particularly in Northern Europe, because most of the welfare state in Northern Europe is financed through a consumption tax, which is of course by nature very regressive. What do they do on the back end that then makes them, is the security part of it? Well, the most important parts are these things like portable universal healthcare, childcare, very, very broad equality of opportunity things that make it so that people don't experience the kind of ravages of the hiring and firing as poorly. Some of it is the corporatist model where, labor and management work better together. And that's something I think we need to figure out and explore better. In the US, you still have this highly adversarial model. But at the end of the day, I wonder whether that solution is the best one. Clearly, you have a structural reality that we are dealing with everywhere, which is labor has lost its pricing power. In the single most important factor about economics, to my mind, over the last 30 years is this fact that labor has lost its. That's why you have no inflation in the advanced industrial world. There is simply no wage inflation because labor has no pricing power. How do you restore that? Can you do it through gimmicks? I'm not sure. So when I look at the solution, it seems to me it is this very hard combination that you have to keep your markets open and relatively lightly regulated. And then you have to have very intelligent universalist policies that provide universal healthcare, universal education, universal training. I mean, Germany spends on its apprenticeship programs 20 times as much as the United States does per capita. So, our tendency has been, when you look at the American system, response, in my opinion, all wrong. We try to save manufacturing jobs by putting tariffs in place. We try to subsidize the effects of those tariff distortions by providing massive agricultural subsidies. We then over-regulate many of these core industries. For example, construction in America is much more regulated than in Canada because you have federal, state, and local regulations, whereas in Canada it's uniform. So to my mind, the solution is this sort of very intelligent policy of allowing for economic dynamism and yet taking the fruits of that dynamism and providing people with huge amounts of, my metaphor is open and armed. You want your citizens to be out there facing technological change and globalization openly, but you want to arm them with as much retraining, healthcare, job, education as you can. That's the holy grail. A few small countries in Northern Europe seem to have gotten it right, but I think we could learn a lot from them.
Great, thank you. So one thing I'll point out is we're not primarily talking about the threat of technological change here. We're talking about adapting to opportunity, some of which is challenging and some of which is not. But I think something you hear from all of us is there are ways to do it, and there are good examples. So now let me turn, this is gonna be our lightning round because I want to leave time for audience questions, participant questions. But let me turn to something uniquely American, which is that employment and earnings of Black and Hispanic workers in the United States have barely advanced since the 1980s, and in many ways have reversed course if you account for mass incarceration, which has 2 million of our citizens in jails and prisons, the highest of any country in the world. James, we're often told that more education is the answer to this problem. Do you agree? You're on mute. I'm going to ask each of you to respond in just 30 seconds or so. I'm going to ask a sub-question to each of you.
Yes, but it is a big part of the solution. One of the reasons why people of color do less well in the labor markets is that they tend to be overrepresented in the low wage, low income jobs and occupations. So that's a factor. So education would help there. But the point about education not being the complete solve has to do with the fact that if you look at the incomes of college-educated median Black families or Hispanic families, in 1999, by the way, there were about 35% of the median, equivalently educated median white family. So that's where you've got education. Today, we've actually gone backwards. The same numbers today are that the median college-educated Black households earns about 18%. So not only was it bad in 1998, it's gotten worse. These are college-educated families. So something more than just education is going on. So education helps, but there's more that needs to be addressed.
Terrific. Susan, when we think about the effects of COVID, do you see that, how do you see that interacting with the race differences that are so prominent in the US labor market? And does that create challenge or opportunity or both?
Right. So the COVID crisis has obviously, affected minorities much more strongly than both in terms of the disease and also in terms of job loss, because the sectors that have been hardest hit have been those where minorities disproportionately work, namely, services, restaurants, retail, and the like. So it creates some real challenges for what is going to happen to the unemployed minorities. How are they going to get new jobs back? The longer they're unemployed, the more difficult it is for them to find new work. And we may be looking at some significant structural changes in the economy that will layer on and present more challenges. Just to echo what James just said, I want to say that, of course, education is important, but it's not the whole thing. And we can take a historical example there. The Black-white earnings gap declined only once in a large way in the last 70 years. That occurred in the 1960s and 70s, and research has attributed that to education, yes, but also to passage of civil rights legislation and, importantly, the extension of the minimum wage to jobs where minorities were disproportionately represented.
Thank you. And Fareed, do you see technology or globalization posing an additional threat to the prosperity of minority workers in the United States, either both or an additional opportunity?
Honestly, it poses a threat for the reasons that the two previous speakers were pointing out, which is basically the jobs that minorities right now disproportionately have. And I think minorities is a very big word. So basically blacks and Hispanics tend to be non-digital. So they tend to be, I mean, if you think about the big divide that the pandemic has ushered in that already existed but exacerbated, is people like us who can work digitally and people who work in restaurants, hotels, theme parks, cruise ships, retail malls, who have to work physically. That divide has grown. So I think it's going to get worse. The solution, though, I do think is it's not just education. And obviously, one of the problems is just rank discrimination. But the real fundamental shift is we have to think of service jobs the way 100 years ago we thought about manufacturing jobs. In other words, we have to start putting in place the kind of protections and benefits and systematization of service sector jobs that took place 100 years ago for manufacturing. Service sector jobs have to be given the same, some of the same benefits and things, because ultimately that is the only way you are going to really address this problem. We are not going to bring back tens of millions of manufacturing jobs to the United States. We are going to take these service jobs and make them better jobs, and companies can do that. They have to reorient themselves, and they have to, spend a little bit less on certain areas and spend more on their labor, and that is a reasonable trade-off. They would still be able to, they will still be able to make money, and that's an area for real regulation and legislation, I think.
Perfect. Great. Okay, we have slightly less than 5 minutes remaining, and I'm going to ask some questions from people entered in the chat, and I'm going to let you volunteer, but maybe I'll direct this first one to James because it's something that he spoke to first. Will the demographics or geography of jobs change permanently after the COVID crisis, for example, away from metro areas as we come out of the pandemic?
I'm hopeful that it actually may, because before COVID, the geography issue was actually becoming a problem just because of concentration and which regions, which counties were generating economic activity. But one of the things we've learned about COVID is the work from home phenomena, and that may actually change not only how companies think about their campuses where they locate, and I think people have been somewhat surprised by how reasonably well that works. But to be perfectly clear, we shouldn't get too carried away with the whole work from home phenomena, because we know that if you look across the entire United States, at most about a third of workers can actually work that way. The other 2/3 actually have to physically show up someplace to do their work. So let's not get too carried away about the work from home phenomena because it doesn't affect everybody.
Great, and I'm gonna just quickly comment on that as well. I think One thing that we will see is a movement of kind of activity away from kind of premier cities where, people are showing up in New York and in London and Mumbai and Hong Kong all the time for 90-minute meetings, and they just won't do that as much anymore. But that will mean a reduction in demand for, Ubers and limos, but also for hotels and expensive restaurants and many of the services. So I do think that will affect the structure of labor demand in urban areas where most of the non-college work has been basically growth in these personal services, things that attend to the care, convenience, comfort, and health of more affluent individuals. So I think that will be a change in the texture of employment structure in cities. Let me direct another excellent question from participants to Sue. How has globalization hindered or helped job growth in the United States, as you understand it? Susan, is that she may be frozen. Let me put that question to Fareed, if that's a question you would like to speak to. So how has globalization hindered or helped job growth in the United States?
Sure. Look, again, drawing on your work, it's clear that it has had an impact on a certain segment of the American population negatively. That is mid-skilled and low-skilled workers, particularly in manufacturing industries. Look, the challenge of globalization is this, and it's the traditional challenge of trade. It is no different. It is that the benefits have been widely spread and are somewhat shallow. The costs have been concentrated and focused so that everybody in America has received, really rather substantial reductions in their cost of living relating to food and clothing because of globalization. Walmart basically would not exist if not for globalization. For you and me, the fact that our food costs 20% less is not meaningful, but for somebody living around the poverty line, that's actually a huge difference. But there has been an effect on manufacturing unemployment without any question. I think that the question becomes, could you have artfully designed some way to slow that process down to allow the society to adjust? As I say, not a lot of good examples of that. The better examples are places that have managed to provide healthcare, cushion the blow, provide healthcare, provide education, provide job training. I grew up in a place that tried to do the opposite, which was, India. High tariffs, a lot of import substitution, didn't work out so well. Just a lot of stagnation and a lot of corruption as bureaucrats gamed the system to provide licenses to people who paid them money.
David, I'm back online, and maybe I could just, in 30 seconds, reply.
Sure, 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, so I somewhat disagree with that position. And here it is. I think that if we step back and think of the whole project, right, in terms of technology development, we were very concerned, the project was very concerned that there would be a wave of technology that would suddenly displace lots of people and result in high unemployment and kind of overwhelm the system and workers. Okay, so the report has kind of allayed our concerns that will happen, that it will be a more gradual process. But we did see a case, which we've been referencing in the early 2000s, when manufacturing employment dropped by 20%, number of factories, a similar amount. And we had, as David and co-authors and others have nicely demonstrated, very adverse effects on many people. We know that when people experience mass layoffs, they experience a permanent reduction on average in employment and earnings. Those were really tied to trade policies and foreign exchange policies. The dollar was very high at that particular time, and of course, China was coming online. Could those policies have been dampened? Yes, I think that a general lesson is that what should be avoided where possible is large and sudden change. And that, in this case, it could have been achieved. And in some sense, to make an analogy to today, we want to flatten the curve a bit. It's not that anybody is opposed to adoption of new technologies, or at least on this panel, adoption of new technologies, the opening up of the world to trade, or expansion of trade. It's the pace at which that occurs. And sometimes policies can be adjusted to affect that pace to avoid what really are inefficient outcomes. So let me stop.
Can I just say 15 seconds? I totally agree with what Sue said. I just think it's a little more difficult to do than people make it out. People forget now there's a mythology around the China WTO accession. China made more concessions when it joined the WTO than any developing country had made in history before. So it's easy to now look back and say what should have been done. I'm not quite sure. Part of the answer is China grew 10% a year for 40 years in a way that nobody expected. So I would love to know what at the time were people saying that we should have listened to, not what can we in retrospect look back and say.
Good. Okay, this is terrific. And obviously we could speak a lot longer and I would love to, but I'm going to say thank you to Susan, Fareed, and James, and it's been an honor having you here. And now I'm going to introduce our next segments on the agenda today. The first is a video that offers some perspective from Robert Solow, who is MIT Institute Professor of Economics Emeritus, Nobel laureate, member of the MIT Task Force of the Work of Future Advisory Board, and one of the most articulate people of his generation, or of any generation. And Liz Reynolds and I had the pleasure of sitting with him recently to share an update on the task force, and we wanted to share some of his observations. Afterwards, you'll hear some fascinating viewpoints from Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. I interviewed him last week, and we talked about his thoughts on the work of the future and technological advancements. I know you'll enjoy both discussions, and now on to Bob Solow.